An assumption of this course is that you have some exposure to the SQL language. We won't take the time here to provide a full introduction to the SQL language. If you need a primer, there are many great options at your disposal. What I'd like to do instead is spend just a couple minutes on the differences between Amazon Redshift SQL flavor and flavors of SQL that you're probably familiar with. When it comes to DML, we already talked about some of the nuances of foreign key and primary key constraints, namely that they exist, but they exist to provide the Redshift Query Optimizer hints and expectations so that it can make good calculations and decisions how to structure the results of the physical query that actually goes out and retrieves the data. But these aren't enforced in the traditional way that most engines would. The same is true of unique constraints. You can specify it, and the query engine will use that information to make better query decisions, but it's not going to enforce it. If you enter duplicates, that's on you. Other constraints that you might be familiar with are not supported at all. Some examples include the default constraints or check constraints or exclusions. Now, because this is column-oriented data, index creation, as you're probably familiar with it, is also not supported. Further, you cannot alter columns. There is no alter column statement. Once a column is created, your option is to live with it as is, or drop it and then add a new one that has the definition that you desire. Now, these actions, namely dropping and recreating, are supported in the alter table statement. The only exception to that rule being if the column is part of a distribution key or a sort key. If so, it can't be dropped. Rethinking what columns you want to include in a distribution key or a sort key pretty much requires dropping and recreating the entire table, not just a couple columns. The list of supported data types should be sufficient for pretty much anything you want to do. There's a small int, an integer, a big int. There's also decimal, real, a double precision, a boolean, a char, a varchar, date, timestamp, and then a timestamp z. Timestamp z just being a timestamp that also supports a time zone. Now, many of these data types have a number of aliases that will allow you to specify the name of the data type that you are most familiar with. For example, you could specify either varchar or nvarchar or even text, and it would all indicate the same thing to Amazon Redshift. What it says is, this is a string of varying length that supports multi-byte characters. In the SQL Server world, that would be an nvarchar. As far as Redshift is concerned, they're all the same thing. Another example is a real and a float4. These both mean the same thing. Float8, meanwhile, has the alias of simply float. The online documentation has a really good matrix that shows all available aliases, and there's probably going to be one that you're familiar with if you're not familiar with the default one. Amazon Redshift also has a large variety of functions to manipulate strings, concatenate strings, pull out substrings, do searches of strings, and all the other things that we often want to do with strings. You have functions to work with dates, including adding dates, finding amounts of time between dates, and all the other things that we love to do with dates. There are also regular functions to apply calculations, mods, rounding, averages, sums, and all the math that you could ever want to do to your numerics, floats, and integers. Redshift also supports both cast and convert, to make up for all those times that the data type you picked as a designer turns out to not fit the use that someone else comes up with. Or in other words, to make it possible to still work with data even though someone accidentally stored a phone number as an integer or a date as a varchar. Shame on you, or shame on them. But not shame on Amazon Redshift, because it lets you get away with it. Now, all of this is very well documented and easy to find in the Amazon Redshift Developer Guide, as are all the SQL commands supported by Redshift, with sample language, syntax structure, and all the acceptable formats.